Hi, I'm Jonathan Hafetz.
Welcome to Law and Film, a podcast that explores the rich connections between law and film. Law is critical to many films, even to those that are not obviously about the law. Film, meanwhile, tells us a lot about the law, especially how it's understood and perceived by society. In each episode, we'll examine a film that's noteworthy from a legal perspective, in addition to being noteworthy in their own right as films. What legal concepts does the film explore? What does it get right about the law? And what does it get wrong? Why is law important to understanding the film? And what does the film teach us about the law and the broader society and culture in which the law is embedded, both when the film was made and today? Today, our film is Breaker Morant, a 1980 new wave Australian film directed by Bruce Beresford. It's a fantastic film. It's adapted from a 1978 play by Kenneth Ross. It swept the Australian Film Institute Awards and has received international acclaim. It's also incredibly relevant today as it touches on issues of military justice, war crimes, patriotism, and the rule of law. And our guest today, we're fortunate to have Michel Paradis. Michel is a leading human rights lawyer and national security scholar. He's won high-profile cases around the globe, including some of the landmark cases to arise out of the Guantanamo Bay, working for the U.S. Department of Defense, Military Commission Defense Counsel. He also teaches classes on national security law, international law, the Constitution, and the laws of war. He's appeared on and written for major television and print media, and he's most recently the author of the critically acclaimed Last Mission to Tokyo, published by Simon Schuster in 2020, about war crimes trials in the Pacific after World War II. Michel is a fellow at the Center on National Security and the National Institute for Military Justice. He received a doctorate from Oxford University, where he was a Campion Scholar, and he received his law degree from Fordham Law School in New York.
Michel is also a partner at Curtis Mallet.
Michel is an expert on war crimes and is really a perfect guest as we dive into this film, Breaker Morant. So I'll just give a brief recap of the film, and then Michel and I will proceed to discuss the issues that it raises. So if you haven't seen Breaker Morant, I highly, highly recommend it. It's based on a true story, and it's set in the middle of 1902. It concerns the court-martial of three Australian officers: Lieutenant Harry Breaker Morant, Peter Hancock, and George Whitten. They served in the Bushveld Carbineers, the BVC, during the Second Boer War in South Africa from 1899 to 1902. And as you may know, this war was fought between the British Empire and two Boer republics, the South African Republic and the Orange Free State, over the empire's control in South Africa. All three men were charged with executing Boer soldiers and murdering a German missionary. It's one of the first war crimes prosecutions in British military history. And at the time, for some context, the British forces uneasily occupied most of Boer territory, but had difficulty winning an outright victory because of the mobile Boer guerrilla forces. Their organization, or their group, the Bushveld Carbineers, the BVC, was formed by the British military to counter the irregular Boer forces. So here you have a context which at the time was relatively new, but was now familiar to audiences today, where you had the army of a powerful state, a nation, the British Empire, fighting a determined resistance that used guerrilla tactics. And so this provides a lot of the context for the film. There's also an important personal element, as the British officers were avenging the murder of a popular officer, Captain Hunt in the case. So there's multiple narratives that are going on. And the way the film is shown is it's done through flashbacks to different events in the trial. Has some amazing trial scenes at the court-martial, and they're all skillfully interwoven. Now, there'll be a spoiler alert here, and we're going to discuss the end of the film during our conversation. So in case you haven't seen it, you might want to pause now and come back and listen after. The men were all ultimately convicted. Two, Morant and Hopkins, were shot. One, Witten, was sentenced to life, although, as we'll discuss, he was later released after serving 3 years and wrote a book about the trial, which is one of the main sources of information that we have today about it. So that's the main points about the story. But now we're going to jump in and bring in Michel to the conversation. And to start it off, Michel, when you first saw this movie, Breaker Morant, what was your biggest takeaway impression?
So I first saw this movie pretty early on in my tenure in the Defense Department Military Commission Defense Organization, where we represent the Guantanamo detainees in the military commissions. And like a lot of stories about war crimes trials, there seem to be recurring themes that resonate, whether or not these trials are in the Boer War, in World War II, or in Guantanamo. And so that's what jumped out to me most of all, in addition to just the amazing acting and the great storytelling that sort of drives the movie forward, is that you have these really complicated stories at the end of the day where the people on trial almost are never innocent. And the question is, can you deny justice to the guilty? And the sort of that's sort of always the debate in these war crimes trials, whether again they're 100 years ago or just this this past week in Guantanamo. And it's I think always leaves you riveted, both in the terms of the storytelling, because the defendants inevitably become kind of anti-heroes in the narrative that you find yourself perversely rooting for, even though they are guilty. But it also, leaves you with really morally challenging questions about the justice of prosecuting people for the wrong reasons, denying guilty people a fair trial. Does that actually result in a verdict that you can stand by? And those recurring themes throughout history are just on such brilliant display in Breaker Morant, which is, just as a storytelling matter, an amazing movie, because it somehow deftly and seamlessly weaves together really two different genres, right? Like you have the traditional courtroom drama that you would recognize from everything from, Inherit the Wind all the way up through A Few Good Men, or a lot of other Aaron Sorkin vehicles as well, on the one hand. But then it's intercut with these just magisterial shots of the South African countryside, and something that is, I would actually say, is less of a war movie in the sort of John Wayne sense, and more of a Western in the Clint Eastwood sense, where the fighting is always done in these dusty plains at a distance. It's very mano a mano. There's no real set battle pieces. It's very much, again, a merging of the of the sort of the genre of the trial movie, like My Cousin Vinny, combined with just the Western. So it's a great piece of filmmaking on top of just being really compelling in terms of the underlying questions it asks.
Yeah, I like how you refer to the Western element. It's interesting that the main, the lead character, Harry Morant, Breaker Morant, is in fact, his name, the Breaker, comes from he was a master breaker horses. Yeah.
He's literally
exactly. Renowned for that. In addition to being what's referred to as a bush poet, he was a famous poet, and the film ends with one of his poems. But you're right, it really does combine those two things very well. Going back to something you said about the moral questions and the legal questions, I think that's exactly kind of what the film does, and explores both of those types of issues. And one of the themes is this is a new kind of war. And so Breaker Morant tells George, the young co-lieutenant, the co-defendant, he says, George, it's a new kind of war, a new war for a new century. I suppose it's the first time the enemy hasn't been in uniform. They're farmers, people from small towns, and they shoot at us from houses and paddocks. Some of them are women, some of them are children, and some of them are missionaries. And I'll add, one of the charges is that they killed a German missionary. So how does this idea of a new war play into either the legal or the moral issues in the film?
So the movie is very much, unembarrassed about making, Morant and the Bushveld Carbineers the heroes of the story, and their lawyer, right? Certainly the heroic sort of fighter for justice throughout the story. And I think as part of that, there is an effort to, justify their actions, not simply as, comparatively okay, but actually like the right thing, right? There's a kind of an Australian pride, and one of the major themes in the movie is this tension between the British imperial system and the quasi sort of British colonial status, the Commonwealth status of the Australians, who are, seeking prestige within the overall imperial regime, and how the British are all too happy to let the Australians do this kind of dirty work that's necessary to get things done, but then are sort of two-faced and hypocritical in condemning it in order to preserve their their sort of self-image as the noble just world empire. And so I think that's certainly the intent of it, right, is to justify their actions in murdering prisoners, in executing non-combatants. But I also think it works on another level too, that is probably unintended, which is almost ironic, because certainly in my experience in thinking about every war and every situation in which atrocities are committed by a side that no atrocities, let me say it this way, no atrocities are ever committed, or typically never committed, by people who believe they are the bad guys in the story. They always have some sort of rationalization, some sort of overarching theory, whether it's the pursuit of history in the Soviet Union or the master race in Nazi Germany. They view their actions as good in that light. And oftentimes that sort of self-righteousness is what leads people to commit the worst possible atrocities. And recurring in a lot of these situations are people saying, well, this is a new kind of war. And you see that kind of rationalization certainly in the Boer War. You saw that certainly in the Second World War, where all sorts of just mass atrocities are justified on behalf of, well, this is a total war, whether or not it's the use of firebombing or the targeting of civilians. And then we saw it again in the War on Terror, right, that we had to throw out the entire sort of 20th century lessons learned because, well, this is a new war involving international terrorists who get to use the internet and modern communications and, commit attacks against civilian infrastructure without wearing uniforms. And I just think that sense of, everyone believes that the world is new, because it always is, in a sense, in a very simple cliche sense. And people, I think, are very quick to justify what can't be justified on the grounds that, well, the world has changed. And so even though I don't think the writer of Breaker Morant intended the line that way, I thought that line just jumped right out at me too, because it is inevitably the rationalization that someone who has done something that they know is wrong inevitably will grab for in war to justify what they've done.
Here's how defense counsel explains this notion that it's a new kind of war justifies the defendant's actions.
No one denies the admirable fighting qualities of the Boers, nor, in general, their sense of honor. However, those Boers fighting in the northern Transvaal, in commando groups, are outlaws, renegades, often without any recognized form of control, addicted to the wrecking of trains, the looting of farms. Lord Kitchener himself recognized the unorthodox nature of this warfare when he formed a special squad to deal with it, the Bushveld Carbineers. And when the rules and customs of war are departed from by one side, one must expect the same sort of behavior from the other.
And what's what's also interesting, there's another level here too, I think, because there's their legal defense is also that they were essentially following orders. Much is made at the court-martial proceeding by their counsel about these orders were to, for example, to not take any prisoners, right? And if you found a soldier that was wearing the uniform of or the clothing of any British officer, they should be shot, right? So, but the idea was take no prisoners, so that in shooting these, in shooting the civilians at least, in shooting the soldiers, the Boer soldiers, that Breaker Morant and his co-defendants were just following orders.
Here's how counsel describes the defense in closing.
Officers of the Carbineers should be, and up until now have been, given the widest possible discretion in their treatment of the enemy. Now, I don't ask for proclamations condoning distasteful methods of war, but I do say that we must take for granted that it does happen. Let's not give our officers hazy, vague instructions about what they may and may not do. Let's not reprimand them, on the one hand, for hampering the column with prisoners, and at another time and another place, haul them up as murderers for obeying orders.
So what do you make of that defense in the film?
Yeah, and so it's an interesting, right? Because this is pre-Nuremberg, right? You always have to kind of watch this. One of the things you kind of have to do if you're seeping in this stuff like you and I are, is you always have to watch this film thinking, okay, this is 1901. What was the state of this law in 1901? Because that, just following orders is the traditional Nuremberg defense. That wasn't, that was rejected at Nuremberg on legal grounds and was rejected in, the Cali case as a defense to the My Lai massacre, following orders that to commit grave atrocities or clear violations of international humanitarian law, the law of war, as they called it then, is not a defense. You have to disobey those orders. But what was interesting, obviously, in the Breaker Morant case, is that principle I don't think was as well established at the turn of the 20th century as it certainly came to be at the end of the 20th century, and that I think also led the British to, instead of just taking a sort of clear moral line like we did at Nuremberg, right? Yes, that may have been your orders, but you violated the law. There was this, again, kind of corrupt element in the trial where the British were in essence, scapegoating these men for what were British policies to take no prisoners, and therefore could not admit that the order had ever been given. So they couldn't take sort of the bright line, legal moral line saying, no, you cannot use this as a defense because the orders are flagrantly unlawful. They had to essentially engage on whether or not these orders had ever even been given in the first place, because to admit that the British had given these orders, would have obviously, implicated themselves in the war crimes, but I think just as importantly, if not more so, would have defeated the whole purpose of the trial, which was to essentially burnish Great Britain's reputation towards the end of the war, as a way of coming to a settlement that was political, that preserved Britain's credibility and prestige, not only with the South Africans but also with Europeans, right? Because one of the things you mentioned that's actually a big undercurrent in the movie and of the story in real life is that the missionary that is killed, the civilian missionary who's assassinated by one of the defendants, was a German citizen. So all of a sudden, this was a diplomatic matter where the Germans and the Kaiser were essentially launching diplomatic protests against Great Britain for the conduct of its soldiers in fighting this war and killing Germans, and that had diplomatic, not just embarrassment implications, but it actually, the Germans were even suggesting, well, we're now going to start funding the Boers against Great Britain, and leading to a much larger sort of military diplomatic conflict between Great Britain and Germany. And so Great Britain needed to essentially distance itself from some of the policies that it sort of unambiguously had put in place. And so, couldn't even acknowledge what we came to understand in cases like, again, Cali or at Nuremberg, that superior orders is just not a defense to certain mass atrocities or certain severe atrocities like those that were being carried out.
Yeah, you mentioned the corruption. I think that's or that element is very powerful. The way that the men were putting aside the legal merits of a following orders defense, the way that they were deliberately hung out to dry for larger for the larger interests, strategic interests of England. They set up this force, the Bushveld Carbineers, to counter the guerrilla force the guerrilla campaign the Boers were waging. They sort of instructed, encouraged them to be ruthless, and then when it came time to kind of pull back, to deal with this diplomatic incident over the German missionary, to kind of reach a diplomatic resolution to the war, they didn't want Germany to come in. They were also worried about Germany competing for the rich diamond and gold in South Africa. They decide to make an example of the men. I think that's very powerful. And there's a great moment when they try to prove that these orders had been issued. The defense counsel tries to call Lord Kitchener, the head British military officer in South Africa, and they actually are able to get to have the request made, but Kitchener's departed. He's no longer there, so he sends in like a second in command. But it's that political element hangs over the trial. Do you think is that something that's unique to Breaker Morant, or is that something that's present in all or many war crimes trial? This larger kind of political element.
I think it's what I think it's what makes Breaker Morant such a great movie, is that it sort of really, in a very clear, specific, small story but big way, unpacks a problem, a theme that you see in almost every war crimes prosecution that's been brought, even the ones that I think are successful and that history has held up as examples of the progress of justice in times of war, like Nuremberg, are replete with examples of essentially political interference in the proceedings, or at least ulterior motives in what charges are brought, who gets charged, and how they get charged, and how the case gets prosecuted, that invariably always, I think, make certainly the rule of law minded people cringe, because the rule of law is supposed to be neutral, right? The very word trial is a word essentially borrowed from scientific thinking. It's a test. Is this person guilty? Has this person done something prohibited by the law? And the whole purpose of the trial is to actually test that proposition. And so when you have these ulterior motives, where the validating aspects of a trial and its political sort of implications are allowed to overcome the fair testing of the guilt of the accused, you inevitably get these real, again, as I said in the very beginning, real problems or concerns about, are you framing a guilty man? And the parallels, the analogies just jump out at you. So the Abu Ghraib trial, I think, is probably one of the closer examples I can think of something like the dynamics at play in Breaker Morant, where no one in the United States military above the rank of, I want to say, sergeant, just regular sergeant, which is about the lowest ranking non-commissioned officer you can have, were prosecuted at all for widespread, notorious prisoner abuse that led to the deaths of detainees in Iraq. And there was, again, a lot of a fairly concerted effort to say, well, these were just bad apples. These people weren't doing what certainly lots of Senate investigations subsequently have revealed to be, they weren't actually carrying out the policy of the United States, when that's exactly what they were doing. But they were expendable because they were low enough on the totem pole. They were what they had done was itself objectively horrible. And so it gave, the notoriety of the Abu Ghraib photographs gave the Bush administration at that time, reason to find scapegoats to say, well, no, this is not consistent with what our policies were, when I think the people, certainly the defendants in the Abu Ghraib cases, had, until their photographs ended up being circulated all around the world, certainly believed that they were carrying out the policies of the United States, and were given every encouragement and indication to believe that they were correct in thinking they were doing what their superiors wanted them to do. And so, yeah, I think Breaker Morant is, the whole idea of a corrupt trial. Is a corrupt trial a trial at all? And does it provide justice, even if the verdict is sort of accidentally correct in terms of that, in both in Breaker Morant and in the Abu Ghraib cases, they were guilty. But to the extent the trial is driven by and controlled by and distorted by ulterior motives that are fundamentally political, I think it does give people, room for pause as to whether or not, this, how are we to understand this trial as, within our history, as emblematic of justice? Was justice served? And I think the fact that we even have to ask that question in a lot of these cases certainly suggests the answer very well maybe no. And that's what, again, I think just is so beautifully dramatized in Breaker Morant.
It really is, and it really does resonate, as you said, with the way with Abu Ghraib, where senior officials, those who are responsible for implementing policy, devising and implementing policies, essentially to go to the dark side, as former Vice President Cheney said. Those people, Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, who approved the memos, no consequences. But the sort of people who were the low-level individuals were the ones who were prosecuted. And it's not that they shouldn't have been prosecuted, as you're saying, I think, but it's just very incomplete, and it does prompt the question of whether justice was served. And now on the trial itself, what did you make of the court martial? You've seen many civilian and military trials, and this is back, this is 100 plus years ago now, right? Early 20th century. And it was pretty primitive in a sense, or in a sense of not a lot of bells and whistles on the trial. What did you make of the actual courtroom trial and the proceedings there?
Yeah, plus a change. It's such a good trial story too, right? It's basically kind of a My Cousin Vinny story, which I'm sure your listeners have watched many times as I have, where the trial process is clearly stacked against the defendants from the very beginning. And because it's a military trial, on top of all of that, there's a certain ad hoc character where the guy who essentially plays what's called the presiding officer, but is essentially serving as the judge, clearly has it in for the defendants from the beginning. And so makes all sorts of ruling that, sort of ruling inadmissible, the most obviously admissible or relevant evidence, and allowing all sorts of dubious evidence in from the prosecution in order to get to the ultimate result. I think there are a couple of interesting tropes too for thinking about trials, and particularly trials on films, and what kind of trials really resonate and sort of like open up the public perception of what the justice system is there to do. And one of the themes that I had forgotten about until I watched the movie again, but which is very My Cousin Vinny, it's very A Few Good Men. It even comes up actually in the book I wrote, which is about a war crimes trial after World War II, Last Mission to Tokyo, which is the defense lawyer in these stories invariably is not actually a trial lawyer of any seriousness. Right here, I think they said he was a solicitor. All right, he was there, and the joke that one of the defendants, I think Breaker Morant, says is, "Well, then you'll be able to do my will after I'm executed." And and same thing in A Few Good Men. The Tom Cruise character had never conducted a trial. The same thing was true, as I said, in Last Mission to Tokyo. This is obviously a famously fun plot point in My Cousin Vinny, and that aspect of the sort of presentation of American justice, I find fascinating that it keeps recurring, but that there's such a romantic attachment to it. And I think it's because, particularly in these stories where the defendants are something of an anti-hero, right? Where the defendants, in a sense, are guilty, not My Cousin Vinny, but in a lot of these others as well, that there is this, I think, folk belief, and desire that the purpose of the trial is to get to the bottom of it, right? Is to get to the truth of it. And so having essentially a pure lawyer who's not versed in kind of all the devilish tricks that a defense lawyer might pull to get a guilty person, off on a technicality, as it's often framed in sort of colloquial speak, is the idea that you have this sort of like pure soul who doesn't know all these parlor tricks, who's only there to get to the truth and to the justice of the matter. That it's this romantic even idea that this innocent can go into the woods and fight on behalf of good against evil, that lends itself to a kind of drama in these stories, particularly because invariably these completely green inexperienced, unqualified defense lawyers are given all the best lines, have every opportunity to sort of unpack the truth, to conduct these withering cross-examinations of incredible sophistication, again, like geniuses, right? To get like the romantic genius. But I do think it just speaks to this sort of, this sort of folk belief in the justice system that at its best, it is there to establish truth and justice, and that it's not dictated by all the things that we certainly fear and cynically sometimes believe that it's driven by, is the sophistication, how good your lawyers can be, right? How much can you pay for your defense lawyers? And rather, sort of focusing on these, again, just the genuine, earnest pursuit of truth.
Yeah, it's great you focus on the defense lawyer. I mean, he's an amazing character. It's Major Thomas. It is the official's name. It's played by Australian actor Jack Thompson, and he's incredible, right? He comes in, as you said, he's country town solicitor, right? There's the joke about doing the wills, but he's never had a criminal case, maybe never had probably never any kind of trial. But he's incredibly skilled too, right? And even though he's no experience, and they also met, right? He's given like no time to prepare. He comes in, he basically is like 24 hours notice, I think, or something, and he's basically defending 3 men in a capital trial. But it's a very powerful and skilled defense in his cross-examination and which witnesses to call, and even in how he handles, I guess, the one factual issue in the case. Was whether the men had actually killed the German missionary. That was disputed factually. The execution of the soldiers was more of a legal defense, but kind of incredible. The underdog attorney comes in and does this powerful job. As you said, he's given all these amazing lines where he tries to justify what they've done, and brings in very powerfully a lot of the equities that you mentioned in terms of the political climate and the pressure that the men were essentially carrying out a larger policy, and yet they were left holding the bag. Anything that in particular stood out?
Well, and it's actually on that. I'd be interested in your thoughts on this too, right? Because the one of the reasons why you would want a defense lawyer, and this is just like basic storytelling, but right, one of the reasons why a defense lawyer who's completely green, right, who's in this is their first case, and it's a total underdog story, why you want that, why that character is always great and obviously just pops up all the time in so many different legal dramas, is that it gives there's an entry point for the audience, right? Because typically the audience are not going to be sophisticated lawyers as well, and so you have this, you have the defense lawyer who doesn't know anything, sort of figuring it out along the way and finding the truth along the way, gives, it creates a natural protagonist for the audience to feel like they're going on that same journey. But here's like something I don't know the answer to, is like, why do you think it's always a defense lawyer, right? There's no underdog story involving a prosecutor, at least that comes to mind. You might have like really sophisticated, like mano a mano, where like the defense lawyer is like the best in the biz, and the prosecutor is, and also going to be, going up against them, whether or not it's, like the O.J. Simpson story or something like that. But you never, I can't think of a story in which the prosecutor is presented as an underdog. Can you? Again, why do you think the defense lawyer is always the underdog in these stories?
Yeah, I was going to go to OJ, which is, in some sense, a high-powered defense. And I I think it's for the kind of, the narrative purposes and the idea, the power of the state, or the government, and it does have that bias though, or not bias, but it does have that slant where it's the defense that's the underdog as opposed to the prosecutor who's being, small town prosecutor who's being outmatched or outgunned by this massive, highly funded defense. I'd go back. I wonder if any of maybe the corporate malfeasance,
so like a civil
movies,
action sort of stories, like the plaintiffs maybe, right, where you
exactly.
have like a plaintiff in a civil case is the underdog against like the big evil corporation that's the defendant. And maybe in cop stories too, right? You get cop stories where the cop is clearly the underdog against, and typically like the system, right, or a massive organized crime outfit or some sort of overbearing sort of force or antagonist. But I don't know. I think it's interesting. And Breaker Morant is sort of, again, an archetype of this, where the defense lawyer is the underdog, and the defense is the underdog against the system that is the prosecution. And so you get to have this kind of underdog story, kind of make the anti-hero defendants, right? These are war criminals, right? That's sort of something to always just keep in mind. No matter how romantic they are at the end of the day clearly war criminals. But yet that gives the lawyer essentially gives the audience an opening to relate to them and to root for them in court.
Right, having that imbalance, and as you say, they're war criminals. There's actually the trial record does not exist anymore. It was never, it's never been located. So it's kind of secondhand accounts, including one written by George Whitten, the third defendant. But the accounts that I've read, other accounts, are that they actually look, Morant and the other defendants look worse than they did at the trial. Like the facts are actually worse than those that came out at the trial. So the narrative is presented in a way that's probably even more helpful to them than it was in reality. Did they get a fair trial? I mean, I can tick off some of the procedural issues. They had obstacles to calling witnesses, lack of time to prepare, lack of an appeal. Even they even refused a request for a stay of execution. I mean, so this was it. This was rough justice, right?
Yeah. I wouldn't say that this was a fair trial. Again, they might be guilty, but that doesn't mean they got a fair trial. And I think those two things can be just in the same way that a guilty person can get a genuinely factually guilty person can be acquitted in a fair trial. You can have guilty people convicted in an unfair trial as well. And yeah, it's but because it's hard, right? Like they are guilty, and whether or not you're a fan of the actual death penalty, which is what they ultimately get, and it is pretty hard to say, well, they should have been fully acquitted. Particularly because, and again, spoiler alert here, but when it comes to the death of the missionary, the defense lawyer is not in on it, to be clear, and they make it very clear that he's kept in the dark. But they basically, their whole case for why they didn't kill the missionary is built on perjury, pretty obvious perjury as well, like rank deliberate perjury. And so, they're full of dirty tricks in their own right. But yeah, you can't say that it was a fair trial, because it started with a conclusion. It got to that conclusion as quickly and roughly as possible. And I don't know that there was ever really, a trial of their guilt, as opposed to a procedure or a proceeding designed to establish their guilt.
In a rough sense, maybe, they did get their story heard, but it from a modern perspective, you said it looks very, very dated. I mean, interestingly, they did seem to get some traction. The defense even seemed to get some traction on convincing some of the officers who were hearing the case. Ultimately, it didn't affect the outcome, but there's a scene outside the courtroom where there was noted how this was kind of troubling, that a number of the British officers were troubled. He clearly got to their conscience, kind of pinning everything on these three officers when they were acting as part of this larger policy. One other defense argument, I guess, and it wasn't clearly spelled out, but I'd love to get your thoughts on it, was, what about the law of reprisals? Does that play into the case and the arguments?
So yeah, I thought that was interesting. They don't develop it a whole lot, because certainly, there's really very little space, I think most international legal scholars would say, for the law of reprisals today. But historically that existed. And very early on in the trial, they talk about how the Boers were essentially systematically violating the law of war themselves. Right? They were not wearing uniforms. They were using civilian positions and committing all sorts of perfidious attacks as a way of frustrating the British sort of operations. And so, in essence, the justification, if you will, that for some of the tactics that were used, including killing prisoners, was based on the idea of reprisals. So that in order to deter, and reprisals, just for your listeners who aren't seeping on this, the theory of the reprisal in sort of very traditional law of war is that when your enemy engages in conduct that violates the law of war, you have the sort of concomitant, right or privilege is probably a better way to say it, to take measures that would also violate the law of war as a way of essentially deterring and punishing your adversary for violating the law of war. And so the classic example of reprisals are reprisals against prisoners. So that if the sort of a more famous example from the American experience that would have been relevant at the turn of the 20th century was the Ulysses S. Grant and Sherman became incredibly frustrated and by the Confederate use of what we would now call landmines. They called them torpedoes back then, but these were basically just landmines as they were marching through the South, as Sherman was marching through the South. And basically the Union Army announced that it would do two things. One is that it would start shooting. I think it was going to start shooting Confederate prisoners if they continued to sort of plant these landmines. And it also used the tactic of essentially marching Confederate prisoners at the front of the army so that they would be the ones to step on landmines as opposed to the Union Army. And that's a sort of traditional reprisal. That would almost certainly be unlawful today, just to be clear. But in the 19th and early 20th century, that was still sort of something that was understood, precisely because you didn't have any real conception of the war crimes trial, right? That's a very modern thing. Breaker Morant is, itself a very unusual example of a war crimes trial. You don't really get things that look like war crimes trials, even in the United States, which was very much at the vanguard of this practice until sort of after the Civil War, but really during the Philippine insurrection is the first time the United States engages in what we would recognize today as war crimes trials. So the law of war was essentially enforced through the system of reprisals. And so, yeah, I think from a purely legal standpoint, again, moving back in time, not looking at the law as it is today, but the law as it is then, certainly all of the killing of prisoners was at least theoretically justifiable as a reprisal of war. But the major legal difficulty, if you don't mind my geeking out about that, with how that worked itself out in Breaker Morant, is the reprisals are announced, right? The traditional practice would be that you are violating the law of war in this way. And therefore, we are going to start doing X in retaliation until you stop violating the law of war, right? So it's not revenge in the sort of colloquial sense. It's meant to be a corrective. So, when the Germans were engaging in unrestricted submarine warfare in the First World War, the British basically announced a policy of reprisal against German prisoners who were captured if the Germans continued, right? And so the whole point was that Germany could stop engaging in unrestricted submarine warfare, and then the reprisals would not take place. And here, the major difficulty is that the quote-unquote reprisals were all being done on the down low, right? There was no public acknowledgement. There was no sort of declaration that we are going to start executing Boer prisoners who are either, acting perfidiously or who we capture in retaliation for these particular Boer tactics that we would like you to stop. They basically just said, start killing these guys, take no prisoners. And that itself is a war crime, which is the declaring of no quarter. So it was an interesting legal issue that kind of they flirted with it, particularly at the beginning of the trial. I think it was like the superior orders defense. It was a defense or an issue that the British government actually couldn't accept in the context of that trial, precisely because the British government wanted to deny that it had ever done or ordered these things in the first place.
Yeah, it's a super interesting analysis of how it plays out in the film, and just to add one thing, which is that there was evidence here that it was done in revenge, right? There was a suggestion, at least with respect to the missionary who they, I think, blamed for, or was partly responsible for the killing of their beloved, respected Captain Hunt. They were avenging Hunt's death, so that there was some aspect of a revenge killing as opposed to
Yeah.
a legal reprisal.
Yeah, absolutely. And that actually has very direct echoes to the My Lai case as well. If people who ever get a chance to dig into the actual background and history of the My Lai case, what basically precipitated it was, I can't remember the young man's name, but there was I think a young, sort of very popular enlisted in Charlie Company, who was killed in like a sneak attack by the Viet Cong in Vietnam, and this just had like a really devastating effect on the U.S. Army personnel who had sort of known and sort of had great affection for this young man, and so that was what in the sort of the story of My Lai triggered Captain Medina to tell Lieutenant Calley that this was they're going to essentially undertake a free fire operation, that all of the people in these various villages were going to be treated as, or assumed to be, combatants and communists. And so when Calley and his forces arrived in what they then called Pinkville, but we now call My Lai, and they found only women and children and old people, they were on the one hand operating under these orders from Captain Medina to take no prisoners, but they were also sort of hot-blooded, there to avenge the death of their fallen brother, which had only happened, I think, a couple days before the massacre. And so these kinds of reprisals in the simple sense, right, just revenge, we see them a lot, and it's kind of it's its own sort of story that I think certainly reminds me, and I think should remind most people, that as much as we at the academic level or the high level think about war in a very organized way, and particularly as lawyers, we think about law, the law of war, and sort of in these very sort of elements of crimes and procedural ways. A lot of war, for those who fight it, is a very just personal experience, where the broader cause and context for which they are fighting is typically going to be at best abstract and potentially even irrelevant. And at the end of the day, these are human beings who are in this incredibly violent, dangerous, horrifying situation day after day. And then, when certain things happen, like the loss of a beloved comrade in arms, they have a very human response to it that we would recognize in, literature going back through all time, whether or not it's the Iliad, and Achilles avenging the death of Patroclus, or, the cycles of revenge in Romeo and Juliet, or just in gangland killings that we see, on the streets of, Chicago and Los Angeles and New York, and Baltimore, every day, where it's, individual, it's, even though there's a sort of overarching organization to the violence, a lot of why people do what they do is really quite personal in motivation.
Yeah, I think the defense counsel captures that kind of perfectly, that sentiment towards the end of his closing, where he says, "We cannot hope to judge such men unless we ourselves have been submitted to the same pressures, same provocations as these men whose actions are on trial." So kind of homes in on exactly the point, on the sentiment that you're describing in terms of how he pitches it to the audience.
Here's how defense counsel explains the impact war has on those fighting it.
The fact of the matter is that war changes men's natures. The barbarities of war are seldom committed by abnormal men. The tragedy of war is that these horrors are committed by normal men in abnormal situations. Situations in which the ebb and flow of everyday life have departed and have been replaced by a constant round of fear and anger, blood.
It's interesting too, you mentioned a My Lai massacre. I hadn't thought of it before, but given the timing, of the film in 1980, that's really one of the closer relevant precedents or example. That is a particularly U.S. focused experience, right? But and this is, I think, is made in the context of it's the Australian New Wave, it's Australian Pride, reviving a controversial but widely revered figure, Breaker Morant. But it's interesting; it does resonate in that context. 1980, we're just a few years outside of the Vietnam War, so it's interesting in terms of the context there.
Yeah, not unlike certainly in the American context, like the movie Patton, comes out of the Vietnam era, right? It's technically a movie about World War II, but it's also a kind of, it's clearly a response to the broader political context. That's, it's basically looking to history to understand the present, as all great movies do. And but from, like, I think, kind of, it's not a bleeding heart perspective, right? It is part of this sort of almost rising tide of Australian nationalism, and a desire to sort of establish a strong Australian identity that you certainly saw on the rise in the 1970s and 80s.
And one of the other interesting things is what happens after, right? They were sentenced to death. Morant and Hancock were shot the next day. That movie ends with this powerful scene of their execution in the countryside. Morant refuses the blindfold, right? It's a great scene, beautifully shot. Whitten, the younger, sort of, more inept, inexperienced of the three, has a sentence commuted to life. So he receives a life sentence. But as it's revealed in the at the end of the film, the film tells us that he was released. He only served 3 years, and then he was released, and he ended up writing a book, Scapegoats of Empire, which is one of the key sources about what happened. Obviously, Whitman has his perspective, but how about this idea that someone who was so vilified and in the heat of the moment and the passion and the political imperatives, right? They're going to get these three guys, and Whitten but they have him set life imprisonment. But all of a sudden, 3 years later, things shift and he's out. Is this something we see what do you make of this? Is this something we see in other war crimes trials in history?
Oh yeah, and it's almost the rule of war crimes trials that if you can survive the death penalty, you will, regardless of what your sentence is, you'll be out within about 10 years, at most, in many cases. And this was true, I think, certainly, obviously, in the Boer War cases, but throughout the Second World War, you had these, war crimes trials, not only at Nuremberg and the sort of famous Tokyo trial, which was sort of the Nuremberg trial of the East, the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, but lots of lesser war crimes trials, conducted essentially all around the Pacific and Europe by Australians, by the Americans, by the Dutch, by the British, and yeah, like a lot of death sentences, I should say, were imposed. But for those who didn't get executed and were typically sentenced to, the extreme, like life, like in this case, like in Breaker Morant, life sentences at hard labor. Political tides turned very quickly at the end of a war, and and certainly in the context of the Cold War and the restoration, let's say, just in Japan, of the Japanese Republic as an independent country and the end of the war there, within about by 1955, if I'm remembering the dates correctly, all of the war criminals who had not been executed were released, all of them. And I think that does go to these kind of ulterior motives that you see, particularly in war crimes trials, where the the desire to, particularly to punish an enemy or to make a certain kind of statement in the context of the hostilities of the war, in the heat of the moment, either in the midst of the war or immediately thereafter, tempers amazingly quickly, and historical memories move on incredibly quickly, so that the people who are believed to be the worst of the worst, who can never be released, are within a fairly short period of time, in terms of even a human lifespan, no longer a priority for anybody. And so, yeah, it's a very, very common story that, the political tides turn, people sort of think with cooler heads about what was done, particularly in the heat of the moment of an immediate, the immediate aftermath of a war, or during it. And yeah, so a lot of these sentences that seem very severe at the time end up turning out to be only a couple of years.
Yeah, and the politics changed too, right? So Japan's a perfect
Yeah.
example where, World War II very quickly shifts, even towards the end of the war itself. Within a year or two, we're in the heat of the Cold War, and Japan is critical to the U.S. Cold War alliance and the U.S. security in the Pacific. And so Japan is now, right, not the enemy, but a critical ally. And I don't think maybe there's a better example, but certainly an excellent example is Kishi, right? He was imprisoned as a Class A war criminal in Japan. And then he was, not only was he ultimately never charged or convicted, but he became the prime minister of Japan, and was later, he's the maternal grandfather of the late Shinzo Abe, who was also prime minister on his maternal grandfather of Abe. So he's a perfect example. The politics changed so much that this person who was a war criminal ends up being the prime minister. So I don't think, in Whitman's case, he's not the prime minister, but he's out in 3 years, he writes a book and he lives. So I think it's you've just got to survive the heat of the moment and the death penalty, and then things can change in a different way than they can in a normal, I guess, civilian criminal trial, partly because there is this political backdrop.
Yeah, precisely because the system is essentially, and I don't necessarily mean corrupt pejoratively in this particular instance, but yeah, there is a certain corruption of the trial process, or at least a political element to the trial process that I think can have a very corrupting influence, is maybe a better way to say it, but that also has potentially ameliorative effects for the accused, who ultimately do get convicted.
So just to wrap up, if there's any other points that you want to make about the film, but if not, just if you want to just leave us, if there's one thing to tell a law student, lawyer, or anyone who cares about the film and law, why should they see this? Why should they see this, in my view, great movie?
Yeah, well, so in addition to just being, again, a great way to spend 2 hours, I would say that the last scene of the movie is probably one of the greatest closing scenes of any movie, which is the execution of Breaker Morant and his one lieutenant. And the last line, actually, of the movie, I think, it comes off perfectly as just, like any good Western line, where Breaker is sitting there waiting to be shot, and he just shouts out, "Shoot straight, you bastards, don't make a mess of it." And then in that very moment, the firing squad, kills them both dead. And there's just that's such a great line to have in a Western to begin with. But I think it also has, a much broader thematic relevance to the really important themes that Breaker Morant unpacks, not just with respect to justice, but to war. It's that, like Nietzsche said, when we fight monsters, we must, endeavor mightily to not become monsters ourselves. And the whole, I think, dramatic tension, at least, and indeed the moral tension of Breaker Morant is, a country like Great Britain, who has, a very strong rule of law tradition, and most importantly, believes itself to have a very strong rule of law tradition that it's trying to uphold, is, getting into this dirty war in South Africa, where they mention it very, very briefly in the movie, but it's creating some of the first concentration camps that end up becoming models for the concentration camps that we see later in the 20th century. They're engaging in essentially terrorism, I think is what we would call it today, in response to what they view as essentially a terrorist organization. And when caught doing that, they're essentially forced to cut corners, to say the least, in their own criminal justice standards, in order to justify and essentially cover up their sort of own failings as a society that believes itself to essentially be liberal, to be on the right side of history, to be advancing the cause of humanity. And in a sense, just to borrow the line, right, they're not shooting straight. And by not shooting straight, they're making a mess of it. And so I think the movie just has so many, again, in addition to being just 2 hours that will go by very, very quickly, just has so many great sort of lessons that are hard to chew on, but that you find yourself thinking about for, weeks, months, even years later, just because it's such these are such important, difficult issues that are very rarely dealt with such sophistication in such a good movie.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And there's another great line as he's being led off for execution. Breaker Morant says, "This is what becomes of empire building," which in many ways encapsulates kind of what you just said about the movie, its message then and its message today, as well as I think a shot across the bow or retrospectively from Australia to the UK. So
certainly in 1980.
Yeah, exactly. So, well, wonderful. Well, Michel, it's been such a pleasure to have you on. Michel is an amazing scholar of the law of war and practitioner who actually litigated many of the most important cases coming out of the war on terror in Guantanamo Bay. And if you haven't yet, I encourage you strongly to check out his book, Last Mission to Tokyo, about the war crimes trial in the Pacific after World War II. And of course, to see Breaker Morant, if you haven't seen it. I've been privileged to have Michel on today. So thank you very much for joining us, Michel.
Oh, my pleasure. And I would say, just to your audience, because I had to look it up again to watch it for this podcast, it's actually pretty widely available. It's on HBO Max right now, as well as Prime for free. So you don't even have to pay for it. It's available to stream.
Yeah, it's easy to find. So check it out. It's definitely well worth the 2 hours. You won't be disappointed. Okay, Michel, thanks again.
Yeah, thank you. Great to be on.